It was one of those mornings where the world felt like it was conspiring to keep me in bed. My alarm blared its usual obnoxious tune, but I slapped at it half-heartedly, already dreading the day ahead. You know how some days just feel off, like your skin doesn't fit right, or the air tastes funny? Yeah, that's what today felt like. A storm brewing somewhere far away, but close enough to make my chest ache. I shuffled into the kitchen, barefoot on cold tiles, and poured myself a cup of coffee so strong it could strip paint. Michael wasn't there. Not surprising. He'd been pulling late nights at work lately, always buried under piles of paperwork or glued to his phone during dinner. At first, I thought it was stress from his job as an architect, but over time, something about his distance gnawed at me. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was avoidance. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. People drift sometimes, right? But then I saw it, sitting innocently on the dining table, folded neatly beside my favorite mug, a letter. No envelope, no fancy handwriting, just plain white paper with Sophia scrawled across the top in Michael's familiar blocky script. For a moment, I didn't move. My heart thudded once, hard enough to echo through my skull before settling into a frantic rhythm. What did he need to say that couldn't wait until morning? Why hadn't he said anything last night when we both sat silently staring at our phones? My hands trembled as I picked it up, the coffee forgotten. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Dear Sophia, I've given this a lot of thought, and I think it's best if we part ways. This isn't easy for me to write, but I can't ignore the truth anymore. We aren't happy. Not really. And frankly, you haven't been the wife I thought you'd be. Wife. The word stuck in my throat like jagged glass. I kept reading, each sentence slicing deeper than the last. He went on about how I'd failed him, failed us, failed to support his career ambitions, failed to understand his needs, failed to be the partner he wanted. By the third paragraph, tears blurred the page, smudging the ink until it looked like watercolor streaks of betrayal. When had this happened? When had I become someone who couldn't measure up? Because the Sophia I knew, the real me, had spent years trying to hold us together, cooking meals after long shifts at the bookstore, cheering him on during presentations, even swallowing my pride when he canceled date nights because something came up. Wasn't that love? Or had I misunderstood everything? The house suddenly felt suffocating. I threw open the back door, stepping onto the porch without caring that I was still wearing pajamas. The crisp autumn air bit at my cheeks, sharp and unforgiving. Leaves swirled around my feet, brittle and golden, crunching softly with every step. Out here, surrounded by nature's quiet chaos, I tried to breathe, to think. But all I could hear was Michael's voice in my head, cold and detached, reciting lines I never thought I'd hear. Later that afternoon, I called Olivia. She's my best friend, the kind of person who shows up uninvited with wine and snacks whenever she senses trouble, sometimes literally. She once broke into my apartment when I refused to answer texts after a breakup. Today, though, I needed her calm energy more than anything else. Hey, Soph, she answered, her tone instantly switching from cheerful to concerned when she heard my voice crack. What's wrong? I hesitated, clutching the phone like it might shatter if I let go. Michael left me, I whispered, choking on the words. They sounded ridiculous, surreal. How do you explain something like this without sounding completely pathetic? There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. Left you? As in, filed for divorce? No. Well, yes, kind of. He left me a letter saying he wants out. My voice wavered, breaking on the last word. I hated how weak I sounded, how vulnerable. Olivia knew better than anyone how much I'd invested in this marriage. To her, I was always the hopeless romantic, the girl who believed in grand gestures and happily ever afters. Now sitting alone in my living room amidst scattered tissues and empty mugs, I wondered if she'd ever secretly pitied me. Oh, honey. Her voice softened, full of empathy but tinged with anger. Did he give any reason why? He says I'm a failure. The admission came out harsher than I intended, raw and bitter. Like somehow none of it mattered. All the sacrifices, all the effort, none of it. Olivia sighed heavily. Men are idiots sometimes, especially ones who don't appreciate what they have. Her words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they rang too true. Had Michael really not appreciated me, or had I simply stopped being enough? We talked for hours, dissecting every detail of the letter and replaying memories of happier times. Slowly, the fog lifted just enough for me to form a plan. Whatever Michael thought of me, whatever mistakes I'd made, I wasn't going down without understanding why. If he wanted to walk away, fine, but he owed me answers. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to rebuild myself along the way. The next morning, I woke up with a resolve that surprised even me. Determination buzzed in my veins like caffeine, sharp and electric. If Michael wanted to end things, he wasn't going to do it hiding behind a piece of paper. No way. He owed me more than that. More than vague accusations about being a failure. So, after another restless night spent staring at the ceiling and replaying every argument we'd ever had, I decided it was time to face him. I texted him, a simple message, no frills, we need to talk. He replied almost immediately, which shocked me. For someone who'd been ghosting me emotionally for months, his quick response felt strange, almost guilty. Okay, my office at 6 o'clock. That gave me 9 hours to prepare myself mentally and physically for whatever showdown awaited. I showered, dressed carefully in jeans and a fitted sweater, not too casual, not too desperate, and stared stared at my reflection in the mirror. My brown eyes looked tired but steady, framed by dark circles that no amount of concealer could fully hide. "You've got this," I muttered to myself, practicing the words until they sounded believable. Michael's office building loomed over the city skyline like a fortress, all glass and steel. It was sleek, modern, and intimidating, the kind of place where people wore suits just to walk through the lobby. I hated it on principle. Every time I visited, I felt out of place, like a misplaced puzzle piece among polished professionals, sipping lattes and tapping away on their laptops. But tonight, I didn't care. I marched straight to the elevator, ignoring curious glances from receptionists and security guards alike. His office was on the top floor, naturally. When I stepped inside, the space hit me like a wave. Clean lines, minimalist furniture, and walls lined with architectural blueprints. It smelled faintly of leather and coffee, a scent I used to associate with late-night brainstorming sessions when we were still a team. Now, it only reminded me of how much distance had grown between us. Michael stood by the window, silhouetted against the fading twilight. His posture was rigid, hands shoved deep into his pockets, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered why I was here. "You wanted to see me," I said, closing the door firmly behind me. My voice was steadier than I expected, though my heart pounded like a drumline in my chest. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Sophia, thanks for coming." "Cut the pleasantries, Michael. Why did you write that letter?" I crossed my arms, bracing myself. "And don't give me some generic bullshit about growing apart. You called me a failure. Those are your words, not mine." He flinched, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. "Good. Let him squirm. I didn't mean it like that," he began, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I hadn't seen in years. "Look, I know it sounds harsh, but I've been unhappy for a while now. And yeah, maybe I should have talked to you sooner instead of writing it down, but what?" I snapped, cutting him off. "You couldn't be bothered? Or maybe you thought I wouldn't fight back." "No!" He raised his voice, surprising both of us. "It's not about fighting or blame. It's about expectations. We're different people now, Soph. You wanted stability, routine, predictability. Me, I needed ambition, risk, excitement. And somewhere along the way, those differences became too big to ignore. Ambition, risk, excitement. The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I had chosen safety over spontaneity, settling into a life that revolved around comfort rather than chaos. But wasn't that normal? Didn't relationships evolve over time? Or was I really the problem? And whose fault is that? I shot back, my voice trembling now. "You never told me any of this before. How am I supposed to meet your expectations? If you don't tell me what they are, it's not about meeting expectations," he countered, his tone softening. "It's about compatibility, about realizing that sometimes two people grow in opposite directions. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. So you just throw in the towel? Walk away without giving me a chance to fix things?" Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them away furiously. Crying wouldn't help. "Not here. Not now. It's not about fixing things," he said quietly. "It's about accepting that some things can't be fixed." The rest of the conversation blurred together, a mix of anger, sadness, and frustration that left me drained. By the time I walked out of his office, the sun had set completely, casting the city in shades of neon and shadow. I wandered aimlessly, for a while, letting the cool night air clear my head. Streetlights flickered overhead, their glow reflecting off puddles left by an earlier rainstorm. The world seemed quieter somehow, as if everyone else had retreated indoors, leaving me alone, with my thoughts. Eventually, I found myself at Luna's cafe, a cozy little spot tucked away on a side street. Luna herself greeted me with a knowing smile, her bohemian style as vibrant as ever. She was the kind of person who radiated warmth, her curly hair always tied up in messy buns adorned with flowers or beads. Her cafe smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, a comforting contrast to the bitterness I carried inside. "What brings you here, love?" she asked, pouring me a cup of tea without waiting for an answer. "You look like you've been run over by a truck." "Something like that," I muttered, wrapping my hands around the mug. Its warmth seeped into my palms, grounding me. "Michael's leaving me." Luna froze mid-pour, her bright green eyes widening in shock. "Leaving you? As in divorce?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, apparently I'm a failure." She slammed the teapot down harder than necessary, her usual laid-back demeanor replaced by righteous indignation. "That man has no idea what he's talking about. You're one of the strongest, most loyal people I know. If anything, he's the failure for not appreciating you." Her words brought fresh tears to my eyes, but this time, they felt cathartic. "I don't understand, Luna. Where did we go wrong? How did we end up here?" She sighed, pulling up a chair across from me. "Sometimes relationships fall apart not because of one person's mistakes, but because neither side knows how to communicate. Maybe he feels trapped, maybe you feel taken for granted, but either way, it takes two to tango." Her perspective made sense, but it didn't ease the ache in my chest. Relationships weren't supposed to be this complicated, were they? Weren't they meant to bring joy, support, love? As I sat there sipping tea and listening to Luna's soothing voice, I realized something important. Whether Michael stayed or left, whether our marriage survived or crumbled, one thing was certain. I deserved better than to be dismissed as a failure. Whatever happened next, I would find a way to reclaim my worth. The days that followed my confrontation with Michael were a blur of sleepless nights, nights and restless mornings. I'd wake up feeling like I was drowning, only to realize I wasn't even in water, just tangled in sheets soaked with sweat and regret. My mind raced constantly, replaying every word he'd said, dissecting every glance, every sigh. It was exhausting, but avoiding it wasn't an option either. The truth was, no matter how much I hated to admit it, his words had burrowed deep under my skin. "You're a failure." It wasn't just the accusation that stung, it was the implication that somehow all the love and effort I'd poured into our marriage hadn't been enough, that despite my best intentions, I'd fallen short. And maybe he was right, or at least part of him was. Because if I was being honest, if I stripped away the anger and hurt, I knew there were cracks in us long before he wrote that letter. Cracks I'd ignored because fixing them felt too hard, too messy. But now I couldn't ignore anything anymore. One afternoon, while aimlessly scrolling through old photos on my phone, I stumbled across a picture of us from 5 years ago. We were standing on a beach, arms wrapped around each other, smiling so wide it looked painful. The sun had turned the sky shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the sand. Back then, we were invincible, or so it seemed. Life was simpler, brighter, full of promises neither of us could keep. I stared at the photo for a long time, tracing the outlines of our faces with my thumb. Who were those people? They didn't feel real anymore, not compared to the strangers we'd become. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped seeing each other clearly. Instead, we'd started wearing masks, carefully crafted versions of ourselves designed to fit expectations we weren't sure we even wanted. For Michael, the mask was ambition, always chasing the next big project, the next promotion, the next milestone. He thrived on adrenaline, on proving himself to the world. But me, my mask was stability, predictability, comfort. I'd convinced myself that by keeping things steady, I was protecting us from chaos, from uncertainty, from pain. What I hadn't realized was that in doing so, I might have been suffocating him and myself. Later that week, I met up with Daniel, an old friend from college who'd recently moved back to town. Daniel was the kind of guy everyone gravitated toward. Charismatic, funny, endlessly curious about the world. He'd always been the life of the party, the one cracking jokes or pulling pranks, but beneath his carefree exterior lay a sharp mind and a keen sense of empathy. We hadn't seen much of each other since graduation, but when he reached out saying he wanted to catch up, I jumped at the chance. We met at a local pub, a dimly lit hole in the wall with sticky floors and mismatched furniture. It smelled faintly of beer and fried food, but the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Daniel greeted me with a bear hug, his laugh booming over the din of conversation and clinking glasses. "Sophia Bennett," he exclaimed, pulling back to study me. "You look different." "Different how?" I asked warily, raising an eyebrow. Shrugged, grinning. "Older, wiser, like you've got stories to tell." "Oh, I've got stories," I muttered dryly, sliding onto a bar stool. "Just not the kind you want to hear? Try me." He flagged down the bartender and ordered us both drinks. A whiskey sour for him, a ginger ale for me. As soon as they arrived, he leaned forward, elbows resting on the scarred wood of the bar. "What's going on with you, Soph? You seem lost." And just like that, the dam broke. Everything came tumbling out. The letter, the confrontation, the endless cycle of self-doubt and second-guessing. I told him about Michael's accusations, about the cracks in our relationship, about the masks we'd worn for so long they'd become our reality. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face and Daniel looked like someone had punched him in the gut. "Wow," he said finally, shaking his head. "That's heavy." "No kidding," I replied, wiping my cheeks with the sleeve of my sweater. "I just don't know what to do anymore. Part of me wants to fight for him, to prove I'm not who he thinks I am. But another part wonders if he's right, if I really am holding him back." Daniel frowned, swirling his drink thoughtfully. "Here's the thing, Soph. People change. Relationships evolve. Sometimes it's nobody's fault. It's just life. But here's the kicker. You can't let someone else define your worth. Whether Michael stays or goes, whether he sees you as a failure or not, none of that matters unless you believe it." His words hit me like a freight train, knocking the wind out of me. For weeks, I'd been obsessing over Michael's perspective, letting his opinions shape my reality. But what if he was wrong? What if I wasn't a failure after all? As the night wore on, Daniel and I kept talking, delving deeper into topics we'd never explored before. Our dreams, our fears, our regrets. He confessed that he'd spent most of his 20s running from responsibility, chasing fleeting highs instead of building something meaningful. But lately, he admitted, "I've been thinking about settling down, finding someone who gets me, you know." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Settling down sounded nice, in theory. But after everything with Michael, the idea of opening myself up to another person felt terrifying. Vulnerability was a double-edged sword. It brought connection, yes, but also heartbreak. When we finally left the pub, the streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Daniel walked me to my car, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets against the chill. "You'll figure this out, Soph," he said softly. "Whatever happens, you're stronger than you think." "I hope so," I whispered, hugging myself tightly. "Because right now, I don't feel very strong." "That's okay," he replied, giving me a reassuring smile. "Strength doesn't mean never falling apart. It means picking yourself back up again, even when it hurts." Driving home, I rolled down the window, letting the cold night air rush in. It stung my cheeks, but cleared my head, reminding me that no matter how dark things seemed, the sun sun would rise eventually. Maybe Michael was right about some things, about the ways we'd grown apart, about the parts of ourselves we'd lost along the way. But he wasn't right about everything. I wasn't a failure, not entirely. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop letting others decide who I was. The days turned into weeks, and life began to take on a strange rhythm. One foot firmly planted in the past, the other hesitantly stepping toward an uncertain future. Michael's words still echoed in my mind like a haunting melody I couldn't shake, but something inside me had shifted. Daniel's pep talk stuck with me, his voice looping through my thoughts whenever doubt crept in. Strength doesn't mean never falling apart. Slowly, painfully, I was learning to untangle myself from the wreckage of our marriage. But unraveling wasn't easy, or clean. It came in fits and starts, like pulling thread from a sweater that didn't want to come undone. Every stitch held memories, habits, expectations, things I'd clung to for years without realizing how tightly they bound me. Letting go meant confronting parts of myself I'd buried long ago, pieces I wasn't sure I wanted to face. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, I stumbled across a shoebox stuffed with letters, photos, and ticket stubs from early dates with Michael. My hands trembled as I sifted through them, each item a tiny time capsule of who we used to be. There was the crumpled receipt from our first dinner together, a cheap Italian place where we'd split a plate of spaghetti and laughed until tears streamed down our faces, a faded movie ticket from the night he surprised me with front row seats to my favorite film. And then there were the letters, handwritten notes tucked into lunch boxes or slipped under pillows, filled with promises neither of us could keep anymore. I sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, surrounded by fragments of a life that no longer existed. For a moment, I let myself feel it all, the nostalgia, the grief, the anger, but then out of nowhere, frustration bubbled up, sharp and bitter. Why had I held on to these things for so long? What purpose did they serve now? They weren't treasures. They were relics, reminders of what once was, not what could be. Without thinking, I grabbed the box and carried it downstairs to the fireplace. The wood crackled softly as I lit a match, watching the flames lick hungrily at the edges of paper and cardboard. As the smoke curled upward, carrying bits of ash into the air, I felt a strange sense of release. Not happiness exactly, but freedom. Like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for years. When the fire died down, leaving only gray dust behind, I sank onto the couch, exhausted. That's when Olivia walked in, her arms laden with grocery bags and a bottle of wine tucked under one arm. "Hey," she said, raising an eyebrow at the empty grate. "What happened here?" "I burned some stuff," I replied simply, shrugging. "Old memories, things I don't need anymore." Olivia set the bags down and joined me on the couch, uncorking the wine with practiced ease. She poured 2 glasses, handing one to me before leaning back with a thoughtful expression. "You okay?" she asked gently. "No," I admitted, swirling the wine in my glass. "But I will be," she nodded, sipping her drink. "Good, because you deserve better than this mess." Her words caught me off guard, not because they were unexpected, but because they rang so true. I did deserve better. Better than Michael's dismissive accusations. Better than the guilt I'd been carrying around like a weight. Hell, I deserved better than the version of myself who'd let him define my worth in the first place. A few days later, I ran into Jack at the bookstore where I worked part-time. Jack was one of those people who seemed perpetually busy, always juggling multiple projects or rushing off to meetings. He was smart, driven, and infuriatingly charming, but also kind, in a way that made you trust him almost immediately. We'd known each other casually for years, bonding over shared customers and late-night inventory checks, but lately our conversations had taken on a new depth. "Hey, Soph," he greeted me, leaning against the counter with a grin. "How's it going?" Same old, I replied, forcing a smile. "Just trying to survive," he chuckled, though his eyes softened with understanding. "Yeah, I heard about everything. Look, if you ever need someone to vent to or just hang out with, you know where to find me." His offer caught me off guard, mostly because it was genuine. Jack wasn't the type to make idle promises. If he said he'd listen, he meant it. Still, accepting help felt harder than I expected. Vulnerability was scary, even with people I trusted. "Thanks," I murmured, ducking my head. "I might take you up on that." "Do it," he urged, his tone light but firm. "You don't have to go through this alone." Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through social media, a bad habit I'd tried and failed to break countless times. Most of the posts were mundane updates about vacations, promotions, or cute pets. But one caught my eye, a photo of Michael with a woman I didn't recognize. They were standing close, smiling brightly, their body language relaxed and intimate. The caption read, "So grateful for supportive friends during tough times." Friends, right. Jealousy surged through me, hot and acidic, followed quickly by shame. Who was I kidding? Of course he'd moved on. He'd practically told me as much during our confrontation. But seeing it laid bare like this, plastered across the internet for everyone to see, stung more than I cared to admit. I closed the app abruptly, tossing my phone onto the bed beside me. Tears welled up, blurring my vision, but I refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring him back, erase the pain, or fix the gaping hole in my chest. Instead, I grabbed a notebook and pen, flipping to a blank page. For hours, I wrote about Michael, about us, about everything I'd lost and everything I hoped to gain. I wrote about my fears, my regrets, my dreams. Some sentences were raw and jagged, others smooth and poetic. By the time I finished, dawn was breaking outside, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Exhausted, but oddly lighter, I closed the notebook and placed it on my nightstand. Maybe healing wouldn't happen overnight. Maybe I'd never fully understand why things ended the way they did. But writing it all down felt like taking control, like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. Over the next few days, I started making changes. Small ones at first. Rearranging furniture, painting the living room walls a soft sage green, signing up for a yoga class I'd been putting off for months. Then bigger ones. Updating my resume, reaching out to old contacts, volunteering at a local community center. Each step felt like planting seeds in barren soil, hopeful, tentative, but necessary. And slowly, imperceptibly, the world began to shift. The air smelled sweeter, the mornings brighter. Even the shadows seemed less menacing, less permanent. Whatever lay ahead, I realized, wasn't something I could predict or control. But maybe that was okay. Maybe uncertainty wasn't such a bad thing after all. The first snowfall of the season came unexpectedly, blanketing the city in a pristine layer of white that glimmered under the pale winter sun. It was beautiful, quiet and still, like the world had pressed pause for just a moment. I stood on my porch, wrapped in a thick woolen scarf, watching the flakes drift lazily from the sky. For once, I didn't feel the need to rush inside or fill the silence with noise. Instead, I let it wash over me, grounding me in the present. It had been 6 months since Michael's letter, 6 months since I'd set fire to our shared memories in the fireplace, 6 months of rebuilding, redefining, rediscovering who I was without him. Some days were harder than others. The ache of loss lingered, stubborn and persistent, but overall, I felt lighter, like I'd shed layers of doubt and fear, leaving behind something stronger, truer. One crisp morning, as I unlocked the door to the bookstore, I spotted Daniel waiting outside, bundled up in a puffer jacket and knit hat. He grinned when he saw me holding up a paper cup of coffee like a peace offering. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing it over, espresso shot included. "You're a lifesaver," I replied, taking a grateful sip. The warmth spread through me instantly, chasing away the chill. "What brings you here?" "Just wanted to check in," he admitted, shrugging sheepishly. "Plus, I heard about your yoga class escapade last week," I groaned, burying my face in my hands. "Oh God, please tell me Olivia hasn't been spreading that story around." "She hasn't. Yet," he teased, laughing. "But seriously, how are you doing?" "Really?" I hesitated, leaning against the counter. "Honestly, better than I thought I would be. Not perfect, but moving forward." "That's good," he said softly, his tone sincere. "You deserve happiness, Soph, even if it doesn't look the way you imagined." His words struck a chord, deep within me. Happiness wasn't some distant finish line I needed to cross. It was a process, a journey, and maybe, just maybe, I was closer to finding it than I realized. Later that afternoon, I met Jack for lunch at a cozy cafe downtown. Over steaming bowls of soup and crusty bread, we talked about everything and nothing. Work projects, holiday, plans, random musings about life. Jack had a way of making conversations feel effortless, like we'd known each other forever instead of just casually running into each other over the years. "You seem different," he observed midway through our meal, tilting his head curiously. "In a good way." "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "More settled," he replied after a moment. "Like you've found your footing again?" His observation caught me off guard, not because it was wrong, but because it was so accurate. I did feel more grounded, more confident in myself and my choices, whether it was thanks to therapy sessions, late-night journaling marathons, or simply giving myself permission to heal. I couldn't say. But whatever the reason, I liked this version of me better. "Thanks," I murmured, smiling faintly. "That means a lot." As the weeks passed, I continued to embrace change, both big and small. I started taking art classes on weekends, experimenting with watercolors and charcoal sketches. The process was messy and unpredictable, but also freeing, a reminder that beauty could emerge from chaos. At work, I volunteered to lead a community book club, connecting with people whose stories inspired me almost as much as they challenged me. And then there was Michael, or rather, the absence of him. His presence no longer loomed over my life like a shadow, though reminders of him occasionally surfaced. A song on the radio, a familiar scent in the grocery store, a fleeting glimpse of someone who looked like him across a crowded street. Each time, the pang of sadness grew fainter, replaced by gratitude for what I'd learned from our relationship and its end. One evening, as I sat by the window sketching a vase of dried flowers, my phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Come outside. Quick." Confused, I grabbed my coat and stepped onto the porch. The air was icy, biting at my cheeks, but the sight before me made my breath catch. Dozens of tiny lights twinkled in the trees lining the street, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered ground. Someone, likely Olivia, knowing her flair for dramatic gestures, had strung fairy lights along every branch, transforming the neighborhood into a magical winter wonderland. "What is this?" I called out, spotting her standing near the sidewalk, bundled up in a parka and mittens. "It's for you," she replied simply, grinning ear to ear. "To remind you that even in the darkest times, there's always light." Tears welled up, unbidden, spilling down my cheeks despite my best efforts to hold them back. "You didn't have to do this," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Yes, I did," she insisted, pulling me into a tight hug. "Because you're amazing, Sophia Bennett. And don't you ever forget it." Standing there amidst the shimmering lights, surrounded by love and laughter, I finally understood something profound. Healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about erasing pain or pretending it never happened. It was about learning to carry it differently, letting it shape you without defining you. And while scars remained, they weren't signs of failure. They were proof of survival. Michael may have left me, but in doing so, he gave me something far greater, the chance to rediscover myself, to become someone stronger, braver, more resilient, someone capable of weathering storms and embracing sunlight alike. As I gazed up at the stars peeking through the branches, I whispered a silent thank you, not to him, but to the universe, to fate, to whatever forces had guided me here. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain: I was ready.